Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, co-author of News Verdicts, The Debates and Presidential Campaigns, among other things, here to talk a little bit about the campaign and where we are at DRB Rosenberg. Bill, welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Good morning.
Trust your weekend was a nice one?
The weather's been great up in the Northeast, and been trying to take advantage of it when we can.
Good, good. And, of course, an unusual weekend. Usually people would be gathered, and obviously this does a lot to change the dynamic of the campaign. I was looking at some of the notes you had put together. I think one of the things that I'm taking away from this, though, is that what you're saying is somewhere around half of the population is going to be very disappointed in early November. Is that different from typically the case or not?
Well, I think it's sort of more prevalent this time in the sense that we're seeing a constant barrage of polls and pundits who are talking about the election, and they're often talking about it in a way that is showing who's up, who's down by sort of what I would consider sort of minimal differences. You take a look at the various polls that are being done that tracked, for example, Biden going up a little bit before the conventions and then getting a slight bump and then sort of returning to sort of a moderate lead. We have to recognize, though, that these percentage differences that we're talking about could also be very well explained by simply sampling error. When you have a 1,200-person sample, the sample could be plus or minus 3% with 95% accuracy. So it isn't that the polls are wrong. It's just that, various people are sort of providing hope upon hope that their candidate is going to do well. And I think what we're seeing is that there's a lot of coverage also about national polls, which have Biden up by about 7.1% nationally, and a variety of state polls, particularly the focus on swing state polls. But we have to recognize that these statewide polls are often smaller in size, which means they have larger sampling errors. So the confidence in which people are placing on the lead or the failure to expand the lead for Biden is probably a little bit on soft ground here.
So the bottom line on polling is we have to take everything with large grains of salt, and especially national polls. But the big point, aside from margin of error, is that we have to also think about the fact that this is a changeable thing, and what could happen is based on previous models. But we don't have a model for a country voting during a pandemic, do we?
Well, I think, that's one of the remarkable things, that in a sense that Biden is winning, and for Democrats that's a positive, but the percent by which he's winning in a time of extreme economic dislocation, a pandemic, stories coming out about Donald Trump talking disparagingly about fallen soldiers, just makes it sort of a little bit more complicated. The other thing that I would say is if we go back, and this goes back a ways, but in 1982 we had Tom Bradley, who ran for governor of California. And there was kind of a problem that ended up coming out with the polls then due to social desirability bias, in which a lot of people did not want to make a accurate statement to pollsters about how they were going to vote for an African American who was running for governor. And I think there's probably a little bit of that here now, with people maybe holding their true perspectives about Trump and Biden a little bit closer to the chest, and maybe not being as accurate as they might normally be in polls. I don't want to condemn polls, though. I think that accurate, scientifically conducted polls are very, very valuable. And in fact, the most recent instance of the 2016 election, the polls were basically spot on. They said that Hillary Clinton nationally was going to win by about 3%. She won by 2%, which is a very small difference, but nonetheless she lost because of the Electoral College. Electoral College complicates much of this because to win the presidency, it's not the popular vote. It's the vote of the 50 states with their electoral college votes, and we're seeing, I think, in my political memory, the first time we've seen so many path models of how Donald Trump or Joe Biden can get to the presidency. Now they're even talking about votes of 269 to 269 in terms of the Electoral College. Remember, the magic number is 270, and the greater role of the House playing in determining the presidency as well.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of thing that in some ways the press loves to have, because we love a contest and we want to hear tension and we want to have something to report on. It does strike me that the polling in 2016, it's sort of like, well, we believe that Team A will outperform offensively Team B, and even if that's the case, that doesn't mean you're going to win the game. So what counts is obviously the electoral vote. I did want to ask Dr. William Rosenberg with us again, professor of political science at Drexel University. Are debates more important this year than ever? I mean, that may be one of those trite questions, but it does seem that these are in different times, and I wonder how important these are going to be, especially because people are already starting to vote, and there's been a question about whether or not there should have been an earlier debate. What do you think?
Well, generally, I think that debates are a good thing. I have been a little bit on the negative side about polls, particularly in the debate between Biden and Trump, because I think you have two different types of personalities, and one seems to be more based on terms of facts and sort of accurate presentations about what the world is going through, and the other less so. And I think what happens is that in the end, though, the people in the public are probably already so set in their ways in terms of who they're going to vote for, Biden or Trump, that unless there's some massive statement of error like, Poland is free that Gerald Ford made in the 1970s, it's very unlikely that there's going to be much of a shift in terms of public opinion and vote intent. I think for a small percentage of people, particularly those that are currently undecided, they may be somewhat swayed by the debates, but at the same time, undecided voters are less likely to vote, so the impact is sort of mitigated in that way. I think.
Last question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, what I'm saying is I think we have to recognize that debates are an important part of our democracy, but they may not necessarily serve us so well in 2020.
Yeah, the last question I wanted to ask is typically we see coattails, a president is elected and it might bring more votes to people on the undercard, if you will, the down ballot races. And in the case of President Trump, if he were to lose to Joe Biden, what would this do to the Senate?
Well, I think that would be devastating for the Republicans, particularly if a lot of Republican voters don't show up and vote for Senate and House seats. And I think at the end of the day, we have to recognize that if we're really going to have substantive change, it's not going to just happen because Biden is reelected or Trump is reelected. The real play is in what happens with the Senate. When we talk about divided government, which is a big issue in a sense in political science, since 1991, we've only had 4 periods in which basically the president, the House, and the Senate have all been on the same page. And if we think back to 2008, Mitch McConnell's playbook was to allow Barack Obama to accomplish very little because he was going to stand in the way. So unless Biden also gets the Senate, we're likely not to see dramatic differences in terms of policy. We will see dramatic differences, though, in terms of tone and also in terms of our relationship with foreign countries.
We will watch and see how it plays out, and of course we'll have more conversations before that day, that determining day is upon us. Bill Rosenberg, Dr. William Rosenberg, thanks again for being on the show.
All right, well, take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, joining us, his thoughts on the campaign and where we are right now, tweeting at DRB Rosenberg, Rosenberg.